My daughter, Emma, is 11 years old, and she's been doing some vibe coding. And the other day, she came up to me and she said she was looking at some coding I was doing, and she saw my IDE open, and she saw all this code, and she said, "Dad, was there ever a time when a developer had to write each one of those characters by hand?" And I was like, "Yeah, it was like 6 months ago." Like, it is crazy how fast things have been changing. And she's like, "But how did you know what to write?" And I was like, that was the whole ball game. That's what we spent our entire lives trying to figure out how to do. That's how I make money. Like, that's why we have the things we have, is because we spent all this time trying to figure out how to write, which characters to write, which words to write. And that's why it is both an incredibly exciting time for developers. I feel today like I have superpowers compared to a few years ago, but it's also kind of a terrifying time for software developers, because the thing that we had spent a lot of time learning how to do is now, to some extent, automated. I think prior to large language models and all the advances in agentic coding that have come around, software developers often thought of ourselves as craftsmen, right? We thought of ourselves as people who were meticulously hand placing each character. And I recently picked up woodworking as a small hobby. I look at, like, for instance, a power saw or like a circular saw. And to some extent, it is like, for the very first time in our lives of developers, we have power tools. And I think we're all trying to figure out, what does this mean? Does this mean that I never need to use the handsaw ever again? Does this mean that the circular saw can just build the workbench or the birdhouse for us? Right? Does this mean that, I'm expected now to make 10 times as many birdhouses as I did before because I don't have to spend as much time sawing? And honestly, a lot of these questions are unresolved still. Things are changing so fast. And so it can both be a very scary time for folks who have made their livelihood doing things, and for folks for whom there's been sort of a steady state of how this profession worked for a long time. But for most of my life, I have been frustrated by how hard it has been to invite new people into this creative expression of programming that I've had ever since I was a kid. I started coding when I was 6 years old, and if that sounds impressive to you, it's only because you don't understand how easy it was to get started coding back then. This was my first computer. It was a TRS-80. It came with a programming language called BASIC. In fact, to do just about anything on the computer, you had to use BASIC. This is what my first program looked like. You would write 10, print hello world, 20, go to 10, and then you would type run. And it would just print hello world over and over and over again. This is easily understandable by a 6-year-old. In fact, coding was so accessible back then that there were these magazines for kids called 321 Contact. And in the back cover of every issue, they would have a basic program that you would copy, not copy and paste, just copy character by character into your computer, and you would run it, and that's how you would get a fully functioning game. And this is how a lot of folks learned how to code back in the 80s. Programming was so accessible. And it's too bad, because programming, as it got more complex and more powerful, it became more intimidating, and it got harder for folks to get started with. I started doing Turbo Pascal, and we started using IDEs. And so you would look a little bit like this, and you'd have some syntax highlighting. But to learn how to code in Turbo Pascal, you had to read books for the most part. Or maybe if you're lucky, you had some friends who were also learning this, and you could ask questions. But it was pretty hard. If you got stuck, it was difficult to get unstuck, right? You were doing a lot of reading and then coming over and coding. This is before the internet, so that it was much, much harder to share knowledge. Then, around the 2000s, programming changed a lot. And you were still working inside of an IDE. But I would say for about 20 some years, the standard way for most programmers to work was they would write some code, they would run into a problem, and then they would Google their question. And Google then would take them to a website, and you would go to a site like Stack Overflow, and you would copy and paste the code from Stack Overflow into your text editor. And then you would tweak it to solve your specific problems. And I say from late 90s to about 2022 or so, this was how programming worked. This was the standard workflow for most developers. And then in 2022, everything changed. And now, for the very first time, you could go to an AI and you could ask a specific programming question and you could get back code that was tailored for your specific problem, right? And you could copy that code in and often it would just work and it would work exactly how you had asked for. And then things started to changing very quickly. Right. And so we started to bring that AI into the IDE where developers were already working. First, in the form of tab autocomplete. So the large language model would guess based on the first few characters that you had typed what the rest of that line might be, or maybe what the next 5 lines might be. And you could just hit tab and have it autocomplete that code for you. Then a product named Cursor came out and it moved that chat directly into the IDE where developers were already working. And so this accomplished 2 things. One, now you weren't having to tab back and forth between your IDE and a web page where you're likely to get distracted. But now that intelligence came right where you're already working. And because it was there, it also had access to your entire file system and your entire code base. And so now it could take all the knowledge that you were already working with and use it as context that was automatically imported into the conversation you were having with the IDE so that the answers it was giving back were even more personalized and were even better. Now here we are in 2026 and you can build an entire app from just a couple sentences, even if you've never programmed a thing before. So for instance, you can go to aistudio.google.com. This is our vibe coding app. You can use it from any browser. You can actually even use it from your mobile device. You don't have to install an app. You just, in a browser, aistudio.google.com, you'll see, click the build button and then tell it what you want to build. So for instance, I'm going to click this microphone right here and say, can you build a screen that emulates what a TRS-80 looked like and maybe emulate what writing a first program that just said 10 print hello world, 20 go to 10, and then run would have looked like back in the mid 80s? You don't even have to type anymore, which is wild. It's going to take the language that I just said. It's going to clean it up a little bit, and I'm just going to click the build button. And this is going to take a minute or 2 to build my app. So you can look over here on the left side. We have the chat. You can watch as it thinks and as it decides what it's going to build. You can see here, for instance, one of the first things it creates is this metadata.json. If you want to see the specific code that it's writing, you can click the code button. So here you can see that it's started generating style sheets to style the app. And if we come over here and click on preview, once our app is ready, we're going to see it right here in this screen. There has never, ever, ever been a better time to start doing that. You literally can take any idea that's in your head, describe it in English inside AI Studio, and see some expression of that idea represented in code within just a couple minutes. It is hard to overstate how much things have changed as a software developer over the last 4 years. The pace has been dizzying, but also incredibly exciting. So if you find yourself a little apprehensive, a little scared about all the changes, the best way to resolve that is to start getting your hands dirty, to start playing, to start figuring out if there's things that you can build for fun or things that you can build for work. And you might find as you start building that this is actually more fun than you thought it was, and a lot more fun than scary.